Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AQUALIS Sustainable Water Compliance Summit panel discussion, Stormwater Management and Maintenance in a Changing Regulatory Landscape. My name is Katie Johns, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Stormwater Solutions. To begin, I'm going to go over a little bit of housekeeping. So first, if you have any technical difficulties during today's event, please put your questions in the question window, and our technical experts will help you out. Additionally, we welcome your questions during today's event and will answer as many as we can after our panel discussion. But please feel free to send in your questions at any time. To do so, simply type your questions into the Ask a Question window on the side of your screen and hit Submit. Also, please be aware that today's event is being recorded and you'll be notified by email when the archive is available. At the conclusion of your webinar, you will receive an email with a link to download your certificate, which can be used to submit for credit with Stormwater University or serve as one personal development hour for attending today's webinar. Certificates will be sent to attendees who viewed this session for a minimum of 50 minutes. For those viewing this session on demand, you will need to complete and pass a short quiz at the end of the session to receive your certificate link. And now I'm going to introduce you to today's speaker. First, we have Joe Moad with the Eastern Municipal Water District. We have Tressa Olson with the Texas Water Development Board, Seth Brown with the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, and David Smith with Water Innovation Services. First, each panelist is going to tell us a little bit about their work and perspective on stormwater management right now in this landscape, and then we'll have a group discussion. So to get us started, I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Thank you, Katie, and hello, everyone. Glad to be here. As Katie mentioned, I am with Eastern Municipal Water District. Eastern is a municipal water agency in Southern California, and I assume you can all see my slides, but wanted to note that 2025 is our 75th anniversary as a water agency. So it is a quite a year for us, and we were established in 1950. Not only as a water provider, but also as a wastewater and recycled water provider. Currently, we serve a population of approximately 1 million residents in Western Riverside County, Southern California. Also stretches into northern San Diego County. We cover an area of approximately 682 square miles. Our area also is growing rapidly. We're only 43% built out when you look at the land use plans approved by the county and the various cities that we serve. So there's a lot of growth that is ongoing in our service territory. We are one of 26 member agencies of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They are our wholesaler. Metropolitan imports water from the Colorado River, as well as State Water Project to Southern California. So in my role as general manager at EMWD, I oversee a budget of approximately $619 million for this fiscal year. We have over 600 employees, and we have a fairly significant capital improvement program. Over the next 5 years, we plan to invest just under $800 million in our water, wastewater, and recycled water system as we continue not only to expand our facilities, but also to refurbish and maintain the systems. Overall, we are the 6th largest public water retailer in the state of California. So as I mentioned, we are a member of Metropolitan Water District. In fact, we are the easternmost member of that collective. Metropolitan, as some of you may be aware, was established in 1928, initially to import water from the Colorado River. They constructed and they currently own and operate the Colorado River Aqueduct. The other major source of imported water to Southern California is a state water project, bringing water from the Bay Delta. And the reason I wanted to mention this, because as we talk about the nexus between stormwater capture and management and our reliance on making sure that we capture, store, and manage that stormwater, especially knowing that we've had very significant, in fact, historic level drought in the Western US and specifically in California, we need to adapt to an ever-changing climate that we're seeing. So Metropolitan imports the water, but that is not the only source of water for us at Eastern. We also have a number of local supplies. In addition to groundwater, we have brackish groundwater desalination facilities. We have significant amount of recycled water that we use. We also do stormwater capture. When it does rain, when we do have water available in a river, San Jacinto River in our service territory, we're able to divert and replenish our groundwater resources. And of course, water use efficiency conservation is a big part of what we do. We've seen our per capita water use significantly reduce over the last 2 decades by about 40% reduction on a per person basis. So I mentioned the imported water supplies to Southern California, specifically from Northern California, the State Water Project. And what we're seeing is a need to modernize our statewide system. And frankly, there's a couple of what I would say strategic projects that we support and that we have been advocating for over years and decades. The first is the Sites Reservoir. Sites is a proposed 1,500 acre-foot storage facility. It's an off-stream storage reservoir. Essentially, it would capture surplus water during those wet years. And we are seeing more intense storms in a much shorter duration in California. And then, of course, prolonged drought periods. So this reservoir would help us capture that water, store it, and then the water would be released when we need it. And it's not only for Southern California, it's also for the farmers in Central Valley and other portions of the state. In addition to Sites Reservoir, there's another strategic project that's been developing, I'd say, over many years and decades, and that's the Delta Conveyance Project. The source of the water currently from the State Water Project is the Bay Delta, San Francisco Bay Delta. There is a lot of sensitive habitat, including the smelt fish and the salmon, and thus there's significant regulations and there's limitations on when and how much water you can pump from the Bay Delta to Central Valley and Southern California. So the Delta Conveyance Project would essentially construct a tunnel underneath the Bay Delta, essentially a large diameter conveyance pipeline. And you are able then to bypass the sensitive habitat, and you're able then to convey the allocated amount of water to the system, regardless of the presence of the salmon or the smelt fish. This is a project that's been somewhat controversial due to environmental considerations, but it is something that is absolutely needed, not only in terms of addressing the sensitive habitat, but as some of you may be aware, the levees up north along the Bay Delta were constructed many decades ago by ag interest, and those levees were not structurally designed or constructed. So if there is an earthquake, if there is failure of those levees, it will allow essentially ocean water to backflow into the system. You'll have salt intrusion into the State Water Project. It would have detrimental water quality impacts to the state water system. So it's also a protection against potential seismic activity and potential failures of the levee. It's a project, again, that's been in the works for many years, but it's through these types of investment, state investments, local agency investments, that we need to modernize our system so that we can capture more stormwater during those wet years. Also, I wanted to transition to a local level at EMWD. When we do bring in the water from the State Water Project, we currently are able to replenish our groundwater resources. We do significant amount of recharge. We have a water banking program, and as you can see here in the pictures, there are facilities that we've constructed, essentially water replenishment basins that we utilize to replenish our groundwater. It's really basic concept. When we have those wet years, when we have those surplus conditions, we want to bring as much water as we can into our region, bank the water, store it, knowing that in subsequent drought years, we're going to need to extract the water and use it and navigate those potential restrictions that may be imposed upon us in terms of water supply and use. So we have been expanding our water banking programs, relying on surplus water when it does occur along the State Water Project. So what I wanted to conclude with is there is a direct nexus between managing stormwater and, frankly, the current regulatory framework up in the Bay Delta, and the need for us to adapt, modernize based on the changing climate that we're seeing, so we can capture those wet years, store that water, convey it or move the water when we need it to not only Southern California, but the Central Valley as well. But that ability to capture that water is directly beneficial to us down here in Southern California and within Eastern's service area, because then, as I mentioned earlier, we have the ability to store that water in the ground, bank it, and then utilize it when we need it. We need to continue to make those strategic investments. We need to continue to manage our stormwater in a more effective manner, knowing that we're going to have to rely on that water in future years. And with that, I think that was my last slide, so I'm gonna hand it over to Tressa.
Great, thank you. I am Tressa Olson, and I am the Assistant Director of Flood Planning at the Texas Water Development Board. So how does Texas plan for flooding? The regional and state flood planning process was created by Senate Bill 8 in 2019 during the 86th Texas legislature. And the programs were modeled partly after Texas's water supply planning process, which was developed in the 90s. This is a bottom-up process. So each of the regional flood planning groups across the state is self-governed. These are all volunteer folks that are fulfilling different roles. So you've got some that are representing business interests, small business, the public, etc. So each of these 15 flood planning regions are based off of HUC 8 boundaries. And then all of these volunteer stakeholders then meet throughout a 5-year process to build their regional flood plans. There are also non-voting members of each of these regions, including Texas Department of Agriculture, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and the Soil and Water Conservation Board that all are able to attend these meetings. There's also ample opportunities for the public to attend meetings or make comments on draft plans as they come out, etc. So we're now in the second cycle of regional flood planning. Each flood planning cycle is 5 years, and the regional flood plans all coalesce into one single statewide flood plan, which is also on a 5-year basis. The flood planning groups direct the technical consultants on tasks, including evaluating local and regional flood hazards, identifying needs, and recommending projects to mitigate flood hazards in the regions. And only the evaluations, projects, and strategies recommended in the regional flood plan and the state flood plan are eligible for state financing under the Flood Infrastructure Fund. And this is really mainly done to incentivize communities to participate in the flood planning process. So as part of the work of the regional flood planning groups, which is all guided by statute, agency rules, and a contract with the scope of work, the groups are required to look at both existing conditions and future flood conditions. They're also assessing existing assets like major flood infrastructure and natural features. And again, looking at these future scenarios under like different scenarios, so future flood hazard, under different scenarios. So for example, for the first time, the groups compiled a list of existing major flood infrastructure and natural features, including information on condition and functionality. And this list will just grow with every subsequent 5-year cycle. The groups also analyzed existing flood risk information, including flood hazard areas, the structure and people exposed in those areas, and the vulnerability of people and critical infrastructure. They also analyzed future risk based on future rainfall, sea level rise, and continued development. Finally, the groups identified existing floodplain management practices by entities with flood-related authority. So as a result of these analyses, the groups put forth recommendations on floodplain best practices in their regional plans. And each planning cycle, the planning groups may choose to require that communities adopt minimum floodplain management standards in order for their projects to be recommended and thus eligible for state funding. So listed on this slide are examples of floodplain management best practices recommended by the regional flood planning groups in their plans and then put forth by the state in the state flood plan. Oops. The regional flood planning groups also put forth legislative recommendations, some of which were adopted by the TWDB in the state flood plan. And then the TWDB also chose to kind of push forward several legislative recommendations. So these included, further funding to finish some of these flood projects, putting into effect flood early warning systems throughout the state, enhancing a dam safety program, and then also creating a new levee safety program. And then you can kind of see some others that include giving counties the ability to levy drainage fees and some transportation infrastructure considerations. And with that, I can pass it on.
All right, thank you. My name is Seth Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, or NAMSA. And I'm going to share some thoughts at kind of a 10,000 foot level about where we are in the stormwater sector and how we can be motivated to stay abreast of what's going on in the regulatory world, as well as in compliance, and what we can, where we might be heading in the future. So that's the view I'm providing here. Before getting into that, I want to share a little bit of background on my organization. Again, National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. We are a coalition of organizations that include state stormwater organizations like the California Stormwater Quality Association or the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition, groups like that. We've got 26 state groups that are members of our organization. We've been around since 2018, and we've grown quite a bit over the last 5-6 years. And we now have 26 total states, and we have over 4,400 communities in that network overall. We're starting to get more MS4s joining us directly, which is great. And if you have any interest in learning more, you can use that QR code or just reach out to me. I'm sure all information is going to be available. But we're getting more and more MS4s joining us, and that's where we're going to be going in the future. Of course, we have affiliate members, which are consultants or technologists or others. So that's the viewpoint I'm coming from. I'm located in the Washington, D.C. area, so I'm engaged on the Hill and at EPA and other, as well as with the organization members that we have as well. So kind of moving on to thinking about regulations and compliance. What I'm showing here are aspects of the sector that need to be addressed in order to address regulations and address compliance. For instance, funding, raising awareness, making progress. All of these things have to be in place for us to have, a good functional regulatory program. So just kind of going down the list, again, throwing out some big picture numbers here. We're seeing a lot more understanding of the needs that we have in the sector financially. The Water Environment Federation has done a series of surveys that have identified this over the last 6 years or so. That is continuing, and we hope to see the new results soon on that. But we have a funding gap of $7.5 billion annually. For instance, the Clean Watershed Needs Survey was completed in 2022, and before that, it was 2012. Since that's the last previous date that we had any kind of information on the needs. And these are needs that are projected out over a 20-year time period at the state level. The bottom line is here we saw a nearly 400% increase in identified needs in the stormwater sector. And that doesn't mean that we've had that much growth. I'm sure we have had some growth, but it's more about there's a better understanding and recognition of those needs and a better articulation. So we're starting to understand, and reveal those needs more so. And now, but our funding is not has not caught up. As an example, we have about 18% of the needs that were identified in the Clean Watershed Needs Survey, as for stormwater specifically, So that's nearly 20%, but only less than 3% of total state revolving fund, clean water state revolving fund assistance has ever gone to the stormwater sector. So there's a disparity there, and then we're trying to address that. Part of that is a raising awareness, and that's what our organization is really focused on, and working with both with our own membership and with other organizations on this. So an example is the ASCE Infrastructure Report Card just came out in March of this year for the second time. 2021 was the first time, and 2025 is the second time. Stormwater was included as a separate category, which is great. That's more recognition. Unfortunately, we got a D, the lowest I think score you can get. We got a D in 2021 and D in 2025 as well. So clearly, that highlights the needs that we have and raises awareness on that. We have National Stormwater Day, which is November 16th. That demarcates the start of the MS4 program, which is what we really focus on. And even things like stormwater capture and use, and the potential for stormwater capture and use as a resource. There's a recent study that came out last year. We're involved with an ongoing study that is getting into issues, including regulations and compliance associated with stormwater capture and use. And Dave Smith will be talking after me, may be able to talk about that. But we're trying to raise awareness on the value of stormwater. And then, of course, regulations have to help realize the value there. We need to, the way that the MS4 program is set up is ideally 5-year permit cycles, with the understanding that there'd be adaptive management. We learn something, or we do get some part addressed in the program. We learn and we progress, and we learn and progress. But I think that there's some information and data out there that makes us think that we are not making the progress that we were hoping to. So maybe we need to start thinking about changes in the MS4 program to become more effective. And part of that is just measuring that in a consistent way. But whatever it takes, we need to make progress. We need to show progress in order to show value for the investment we're putting in, which is on the order of $20 billion a year annually across the country in municipal programs. And of course, regulations are tied with legal issues, and we see with the Supreme Court rulings, we've covered that quite a bit as an organization. We will continue to do so. The regulations that are tied to legal rulings are very dynamic, and these type of events that we're having here are critical in staying on top of these changes in the ties between the legal landscape and the policy and regulatory landscape. And I do think that, there are some challenges with this current administration, but there are also opportunities. So that's something that I think we need to keep our minds open and look for those opportunities as we move ahead. We could talk about that if time allows here. We're also trying, in order, again, to try to make regulatory and policy progress, we need leadership. And one example is the Centers of Excellence for Stormwater Infrastructure Technology. These are EPA-funded centers some are moving ahead. There were 4 that were awarded. We're on one of the teams. I'm confident these will be moving forward in the near term. This will be a new place where we're going to hear about more innovation, more tools, and ways to make progress in the stormwater sector. So that's something to think about in the leadership context. And also, we are working with a number of other organizations to have a conversation on leadership for policy, so we can have a more unified discussion that goes on. Again, if we think about regulations, I think we're going to see more and more performance-based regulations in the future, which is why we have been investing in our stormwater testing and evaluation for products and practices, or STEP program. You can think about this as a consumer reports for stormwater infrastructure, because we know that performance is significant now, and it's going to be even more significant in the future, having understanding of how stormwater infrastructure works. And thinking about O&M, we need to know how it works today. We also need to know how it works over time. Is there performance decay? What kind of maintenance is needed in order to maintain a level of performance that's expected and understood and will allow us to keep in compliance? Last 2 things I want to talk about real quickly are the data considerations that are out there. We're going to have the electronic reporting rule, or e-reporting rule, in 2026. That'll become live in 2026, and that's going to change the way that we report out on our progress and our compliance. So that's something to be aware of, and I think that's going to help drive standardization of how we report and how we look at assets and as well as reporting data. And lastly, an evolving challenges we see in the future are the two big things that we hear a lot about are emerging contaminants, PFAS, 6-PPD, these type of things, microplastics. That's something to be aware of in compliance. And there's lots more that we can talk about in the regulatory environment there, but also resilience planning and investment. It's needed especially at the local level, but it's needed at all levels, really. So I'll wrap up here and I'll hand it over to Dave Smith to wrap things up.
Well, thank you, Seth. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Smith, and I'm a water policy consultant and researcher. I focus on integration of water systems, including stormwater, wastewater, and drinking water systems, flood control systems, and look a lot at financing, permitting, and organizational collaboration issues that those water managers face. I spent most of my career at the US EPA's Pacific Southwest region. Before I talk about some of the national issues and trends in stormwater permitting, I wanted to say a little bit about the compliance and enforcement side of things. Yesterday, I talked to 2 EPA regional stormwater compliance managers to just kind of get a sense of how things going over there with the advent of the new administration, and what do you have on your minds going forward. So I want to just share a couple of things that we talked about. First, importantly, they're open for business. I mean, rumors about the demise of EPA's enforcement presence are overblown. Now, who knows what will happen in the future, but they're doing inspections, they're doing stormwater audits, they're taking enforcement actions. And so you need to pay attention to what's happening on the compliance side. I heard that they're thinking more and more about how should they provide a compliance presence in looking at systems that have a lot of aging infrastructure. I sense that there's more of a focus in some inspections at the state level and the EPA level about whether BMPs are being properly maintained and whether local stormwater program managers are really keeping an eye on operations and maintenance, particularly on BMPs that they may not be directly responsible for. There's also increasing interest in encouraging adoption of asset management systems and programs that help local programs really track and stay on top of what's happening with stormwater assets and intervene to do what's necessary before they fail. Earlier, you heard from Tressa and Joe about interests in flood control, in capturing stormwater for later use. And overall, I'm sensing on the compliance side, increasing interest in how to look at stormwater systems that are trying to implement projects that yield these kinds of multiple benefits. And I think they're realizing they're going to have to learn more about how to look at these permits and look at these programs beyond water quality concerns. That'll be a learning experience for them. I think everybody's wondering how the electronic reporting is going to really work, and ask, does that really yield more usable data and information? Personally think the jury's still out on that, but we'll find out fairly soon. I'll be interested to hear about your experiences in trying to stand up electronic reporting as we go. Overall, I sense that there's going to be a little bit more interest in working with permittees to fix compliance problems, maybe without having to take enforcement actions, although I do think enforcement is on the table as an option. So my number one advice to you is to get to know your compliance people, your inspectors. I feel like those who have relationships with the folks that work on compliance, they seem to find a way to work together more cooperatively. But that said, there is a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, particularly at the federal level, as the new administration continues to implement its various priorities and initiatives. So wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of important recent Supreme Court decisions that might have impacts in the stormwater sector. There's a number of cases that may have impacts in the stormwater world. And if you're interested, NAMSA, the organization that Seth leads, recently held a national webinar to talk about a variety of cases and how they will affect the stormwater world. And those can be accessed on NAMSA's website and their video channel. The first one I want to talk about is the Loper-Bright decision. And that's a case, not directly a water case, that essentially ended the practice of providing deferences to agencies and how they interpret rules where the underlying statutory language might be vague. And some of you might recognize this was called Chevron deference for many, many years. And the court essentially found that the agencies are not going to get deference in how they interpret these vague statutory requirements, and that the courts are going to be the ones that decide what the law really means. This could lead to more challenges to permits and the associated federal rules, even though the stormwater rules have not been updated in quite a while. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether this is going to trigger additional challenges to permits. I think it's quite possible that this decision will reduce EPA's interest in reopening the stormwater regulations, although there is some pressure to do so, since those rules have not been meaningfully updated for really 30 years. There's another case that may lead to even more changes in the stormwater world. A fairly recent decision with City and County of San Francisco v. EPA, and that's a case that revolved around combined sewer operation permitting. And in that decision, the court barred the use of so-called end result permit limitations in these permits, and these are Clean Water Act permits. So, for example, it would not be permissible anymore to include a requirement that you must ensure that the water quality standards are met in the receiving water that you discharge to. The court essentially found that that doesn't provide specific enough direction to a permittee about what they have to do to be in compliance with their permit. Importantly, the decision does preserve the use of both specific narrative and numeric limitations in these permits. So the use of narrative limitations in stormwater permits, which is very common, that can still happen, although there could be some greater scrutiny about how those narrative limits are written to make sure they provide adequate direction to permittees about what they're actually supposed to do. Some commentators are saying that this decision could lead to greater use of numeric limitations for stormwater discharges in permits, which that's a practice which is common in some parts of the country, but not in others, and would certainly be controversial in many areas. And as I said, I think that this could lead to increasing scrutiny about how narrative limits are being written so that it really is clear about what a permittee needs to do to be in compliance with a narrative limitation. I should have put it on the slide, but I'll just mention one other case to keep an eye on, which is very interesting, is the Puget Sound case, where the up at Tacoma and the Puget waterkeeper, I believe. That case has not been accepted by the Supreme Court, but it looks like it will be. And it gets at the issue about whether it is permissible to challenge a state-issued NPDES permit that includes requirements in the permit under state law requirements that are not actually required by under federal law. And is it permissible to challenge that permit in federal court over those state law requirements? Because in many states, it's difficult to challenge these permits in state court. So a lot of people are watching that because it could really have effects on whether and how NGOs, environmental groups, other interested parties can challenge these permits in federal court over those types of provisions. So I wanted to talk about a couple of what I'll just call coming attractions in the stormwater permitting world. The administration so far has not been crystal clear about some of its priorities, but in general, there is interested in permit improvement and, in their terms, streamlining. Most of the focus on that to date has been on energy-related permitting, and I think the idea is that they're interested in making it easier for energy-related projects and facilities to go online. And so there's a lot of focus on the National Environmental Policy Act and NEPA compliance, air permitting, pipeline permitting, and energy, oil field related permitting, that kind of thing. So it's unclear whether that interest in permit improvement and streamlining is going to carry over it more into the water sector. There's also some congressional interest in seeing more emphasis placed on permit improvement and streamlining, because many people, including in the water sector, are feeling that there's a lot of room for improvement in permits and perhaps a lot of wasted energy in meeting permit requirements that people feel are not contributing as much to water quality improvement as they could. Anything that involves reopening the Clean Water Act or the regulations is likely to be very controversial. And so I think that my guess is that it would be very difficult to achieve any fundamental changes in the underlying structure of permitting in the Clean Water Act, or even in maybe reopening the stormwater regulations to clarify some of the aspects of NPDES requirements for stormwater. But we shall see. I think that San Francisco decision that I mentioned will prompt many states to rethink the kinds of narrative limits they put into permits, because I looked around and I found a lot of states that incorporate in current permits these sort of end result permit requirements that you can't cause and contribute to a standards violation, things like that, which I don't think would survive the holding that the court made in the San Francisco case. So there may be a need to remove those kinds of provisions from permits or to justify their inclusion based solely on state law authorities. So stay tuned to see some changes in that area. I also think you're going to see increased interest in looking at how permits can address multiple objectives. As I mentioned, prior speakers did talk a little bit about flood control, about stormwater capture and use. And we're in the stormwater world, we're increasingly seeing interest in sort of one water management concepts that view stormwater as a resource, and looking at permits to avoid creating barriers to multi-benefit approaches, and maybe even creating incentives for local stormwater managers to pursue stormwater management approaches that produce those additional benefits. Now, that's going to require some thinking about how to write permits to reduce barriers and to provide incentives. A lot of discussion is going on in that area. I also think that there's going to be interest in looking at how permits can encourage the use of more dynamic stormwater management tools. And we've touched on some of these already. I would highlight maybe changing the way we think about monitoring requirements, and maybe doing away with existing monitoring approaches, which in many cases yield data that, at least in my view, is not that useful in evaluating ultimate compliance and in figuring out whether stormwater systems are operating the way they really should. Gives an opportunity maybe to pursue more real-time monitoring, real-time data analysis using big data analysis methods, rather than sort of old-fashioned grab sampling methods that are used in most of the country. I mentioned before an increasing interest in investing in asset management systems to help plan and keep an eye on the maintenance of these systems over time. And it could be that there'll be some push in more states to either require or greatly encourage the use of asset management systems in stormwater programs. And then as Seth mentioned, I think there's going to be increasing interest in showing that through testing and validation that BMPs are probably going to work as advertised, rather than kind of arm-waving type demonstrations that people are using to say, we think these are going to work and are going to be adequate. So I'm going to stop now because I would love to hear your questions and try to hear a little bit more about what's on your mind. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. We are going to have a little group discussion for a few minutes, and then we'll save the last 10 minutes or so we have for audience questions that have been rolling in the whole time. But I want to start probably with Tressa and Joe. You could probably speak to this. At a local and state level, when you're doing things such as, Tressa, the Texas state flood plan, how do you take regulations into account when you're working through all of that?
Sure. So as part of their scope of work, the regional flood planning groups are supposed to look at, what regulations are locally for them and how communities and counties. So based off of that, they can put together, recommendations for future practices as a bar to entry to participating in the planning process, let's say. That hasn't happened during the first cycle, but it may in future cycles. But it also may affect what flood risk looks like in the future, right? If entities aren't, if they don't have minimum standards for their floodplains and development continues as it is, what is that going to look like? How is that going to increase risk? So those are all of the facets that we ask the planning groups to look at really when they're developing their plans.
Sure. Joe, do you have any insight on that from the work you're doing in California?
So from our perspective, any federal or state regulations have a direct impact on how we monitor and report on water quality. For a recent example, I think many are familiar with is the EPA's advancement of MCLs for PFAS, which also translate to a state regulations as well. So there is a direct nexus between stormwater and potable water that we're seeing in terms of PFAS being introduced to the stormwater system and being conveyed through the stormwater system to drinking water reservoirs. So for us, as we see those regulations being implemented, it impacts us because we have to establish monitoring programs, we have to establish reporting programs to demonstrate compliance to both the state and in some cases to federal agencies. So there is a great need for us to be in tune and to make sure not only are we in compliance, but we're also advocating to our policymakers up in Sacramento and also in Washington, D.C. on what is practical and what can be done based on the science. So that's how we look at the regulatory impact on the water system for us.
Gotcha. And, when you're, looking at best practices and things, how do you prepare for future compliance with all these permits? And that's open, to anybody.
So maybe I'll start and hand it over to the others. But for us, we engage with our regulatory folks or early on. I think early engagement is key for us. It's the Regional Water Quality Control Board, the State Water Resources Control Board, and the EPA, the state EPA, and we also go back to Washington D.C. on a regular basis, meet with the EPA and other regulators. But we need to anticipate what's coming down the pipeline, if you will, and way ahead of when those requirements are published in our permits. I think we need to be aware of the evolving regulatory climate, which ultimately will make it into permits that we have to comply with. But the idea is to not only be aware of those regulatory requirements, but try to guide them where we can, try to provide valuable input and rationale to the regulators so that what ends up in the permit is something that can be practically implemented for us. So that's how we try to stay ahead of the regulatory framework.
I would just add that I think knowledge is power. And what we see is stormwater systems vary a lot in how specific and detailed their understanding of their own systems are. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of assets in a stormwater system. You've got the pipes and the pumps and the basins and things like that, but you also have all of the equipment and all of the personnel resources that are involved in doing inspections, education, other things like that. And I think it's just really important that systems have a detailed understanding of what assets their system actually includes. so that when they're working with the regulatory agencies, they can report accurately on what's going on in their system and be able to show people where the different aspects of the system located. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think there's going to be increasing focus on whether systems are being adequately maintained as they age. And so systems that have invested in better mapping, often GIS-based mapping of their systems, or the use of asset management systems, are in a better position to report on the status of their systems and kind of show that, hey, we're on top of this. We have a good sense of what our system requires, and it's working the way it's supposed to. That really helps in building confidence among inspectors and among the regulatory agencies that these folks kind of know what they're doing and are on top of what they need to be addressing.
I'll add that as an organization, and as has been said already, that we need to stay engaged because what we hear as policy eventually makes its way oftentimes into permits. So as an organization, we're trying to engage earlier in the process. Historically, in the stormwater sector, I think we are not at the table. We're often responding to or reacting to changes that have been made, and we're trying to change that by having an ongoing engagement. And again, I think it's good to engage with regulators, and that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything, but I think having a positive and constructive relationship with regulators is helpful in understanding what's coming down the pipe. And you can also provide input on the practicalities or the pragmatic challenges of what's being asked or what regulators are considering. So I think we try to get involved earlier in the process, and that's part of what I do on behalf of the MS4 sector here in the Washington, D.C. area, because I do think that that we need to change that dynamic, and hopefully we'll be successful in doing that.
Awesome. And then this is a broad question, but just some, the big players from a national level, what major changes to regulations are you seeing around, this time right now? I know you mentioned a few. I think Seth and Dave, you mentioned a few, but
Dave, you should go for it. Yeah.
Well, I'll kick it off. I mean, notably, there's nothing happening right now. And, I've asked a number of folks at EPA in the leadership since the change in administrations, do you plan to reopen the regulations? And I think that the answer is nobody is sure. Yes, there is interest in permit improvement and streamlining. I think there's a recognition that to do that, you would either need to reopen and revise the Clean Water Act, which for 30 years has been almost like a third rail. Nobody's wanted to touch it in big ways, or reopen the regulations. I think that eventually there may be interest in this administration in reopening the regulations, but there are pretty strong feelings that don't always align about what needs fixing. And so I think it would be a long and contentious process. I know that I've been encouraging, and some others have been encouraging, that there's opportunities to improve permitting within the context of the existing rules and the existing statute. And there's a lot of flexibilities in how NPDES permits are written. And what we found is in many cases, federal and state permit writers may not be fully aware of those flexibilities, or they may not feel like they have the time and the energy to apply them in unusual situations. But I mean, what we see in a lot of states is stormwater permits are kind of a negotiated thing, particularly for larger systems, and when phase 2 and industrial general permits are being written. So I do think that there are going to be some opportunities for people to raise issues about, hey, we see an opportunity to do things more cost effectively if you let us do X. And an example I gave when I talked before was around how monitoring is done. What kind of frequency of monitoring for what constituents, using what methods. And to really ask hard questions about, are we collecting data in a way that can be used to help with decision making and for evaluation. And I feel like that in much of the monitoring that happens in the stormwater sector is not really all that useful. And I see what, having known how my colleagues in enforcement programs have looked at these often 500-page annual reports, they don't go through there and dig through tables of data to figure out what's going on. And so it can be quite difficult. So I do see opportunities to maybe rethink about how some permit provisions are written to yield some efficiencies there. But reopening the regulations, wholesale change in how permitting is done, I would be surprised to see that soon. A lot of permittees like stability. And even though changes in the regs, changes in the law could lead to things that reduce burdens on permittees, those kinds of changes can create a lot of instability, and that instability is of concern to a lot of local program managers.
And Katie, if I can add, I agree with Dave's comment. I think for us, stability and certainty relative to regulations is key. One thing that we're engaged on right now on the federal level and the state level is the waters of the U.S. Regulations. And I think many of your listeners may be familiar with the Sackett ruling recently. And there is a bit of a tension, I think, between the federal waters of U.S. regulations and what's happening on the state side in California, where there's legislation being introduced to establish primacy relative to protection of wetlands and tributaries to navigable waters. So we're very much impacted by those definitions of what is waters of the U.S. We have facilities that are connected to potential tributaries that would fall under that definition. So we have been very engaged with our representatives back in D.C. and frankly the state representatives as well. But the waters of the U.S. Changes that may be forthcoming is something that would impact us, and we're engaged both on a federal and a state level.
Awesome. All right. I am going to move into a couple audience questions for our last 5 minutes or so. So Tressa, this one came in while you were speaking, so I'm assuming it's for you. Does the Texas flood planning address pluvial flooding as well as coastal and ravine flooding? And if so, what precipitation frequency estimates do you use? Is it AQUALIS 14?
Yeah, so the groups are asked to identify flood risk in their regions, including riverine, pluvial, including urban flooding, coastal flooding. And then they're also asked to look at possible flood-prone areas. And so these are areas that can maybe be identified through local knowledge that have not been previously identified as mapped hazard areas. We give them a lot of leeway when they're building their plans, so we want them to use best available data. In this case, that might be AQUALIS 14, or they can, if they choose another source of information that they deem to be a better quality, that they're allowed to use that. If AQUALIS 15 were to come out during this planning cycle, we would ask that they look into that as well, but they are not required to. And I think during the second planning cycle, we're having them look at including 10%, 1%, and 0.2% frequencies.
Okay, awesome. Okay, let's see. Do you all think San Francisco versus EPA can lead to permits being unable to be rewritten? With the court's requirement of specific limitations, permitting language must then become more specified, which would then lead to lawsuits and delays on the renewal of new permits. I know none of you have a crystal ball, but what are your thoughts on?
I'm none of us are lawyers, I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. I think thinking of us are lawyers. So I think we're all speculating here, but I think there will definitely be some impacts from this case. As I think Dave mentioned, and Dave, you should definitely speak up because I think you've been doing a lot of the thinking that I've heard on this topic. But I do think that there is whether or not it's going to lead to more problems. I think it'll lead to more questions. I think we could say that, and probably lead to issues of, well, one of the questions that came up on that, or topics or whatnot, and that ruling was about narrative, the use of narrative language in permits and narrative provisions. It didn't say that they weren't allowable. So that's, and narratives are provisions are common in stormwater permits. Again, Dave can elaborate on this more than me. But they didn't say they're not usable. But I do think in the context of the whole ruling, we're going to see more specifics, even in the context of narrative language in those provisions. So that's how that shakes out is going to be one of the questions. And again, I think we're going to see more of a interest in trying to get to something like numerics or close to that, like that level of specificity. And the question is going to be how specific, how numeric like. I think we'll see some of these permits in the future. But Dave, I know that you've got a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll defer to you on that.
Well, I don't want to go on and on about this, but I would just add that I think it is possible in a few states that you may see greater use of numeric limits, where they may simply say, or they're going to throw up their hands and basically say, we can't figure out how to write specific enough narrative limits to comply with this decision. So we're just going to say you need to meet 5 milligrams per liter of pollutant X at the end of each discharge pipe. A permit approach that would be, let's just say, unpopular in some quarters. I think that what you may see is a rethinking about how narrative limits are written, where I've been looking at a lot of permits around the country in the last 2 weeks, and a lot of them have provisions that more or less say, in addition to doing the 6 minimum measures, you need to implement enough additional BMPs to address your water quality problems. That's not too different from saying you can't cause and contribute to a standards violation. So it may be that there will need to be at least another layer of specificity in how those narrative limits are written. For example, saying you need to implement BMPs that are consistent with, say, the Riverside County approved BMP manual. Many states and counties have some kinds of manuals of approved management practices, which I guess in theory have been demonstrated to be effective. And so making a connection to something tangible that a permittee can look at and say, well, okay, if I pull BMPs out of the manual, I'm going to be okay in terms of compliance. That kind of detail you may see more of. But the bottom line is you're going to probably see fewer EPA permit writers, and in many budget impacted states, either flat or declining numbers of permit writers. So the job's not going to get easier, and there's going to be fewer permit writers to do it. So I do think it will slow things down, but things will not grind to a halt.
Okay. Well, thank you all. That is unfortunately we've run out of time for the rest of the questions. Any we didn't get to, we will do our best to answer offline. As a reminder, at the conclusion of this session, you'll receive an email with a link to download your certificate for that PDH. And I hope you join us for our next 2 sessions. And I also want to thank Seth, Dave, Joe, and Tressa for their time and insight today. Thank you so much. And you can join either of our next 2 sessions by exiting out of this one and going back into the agenda and selecting the session you would like to attend. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you in our next session.
Thank you.
Thanks. Happy Earth Day, everyone.